Thieves harass a lone rancher, unaware she once outgunned the most feared outlaw in the West. The morning sun cast long shadows across Kate Reynolds' weathered porch as she stood motionless, coffee mug warming her calloused hands. At 52, her silver-streaked auburn hair was gathered in a simple braid, her posture military straight despite the years. 3 miles down the dusty road, a cloud of dust signaled visitors. Kate's eyes narrowed slightly. In 7 years at Copper Valley, unannounced guests had never brought good news. The locals knew little about her. Former Marine, kept to herself, good with animals, what they didn't know would fill volumes. Sheriff Tom Whitaker removed his hat as he stepped into the cool dimness of Copper Valley's only diner. His weathered face showed the strain of a man who just had a confrontation he'd rather have avoided. "She's not leaving, is she?" Eleanor Hudson, the diner's owner, slid a cup of coffee across the worn counter. "Not a chance," Tom sighed. "I warned her about the Mendy's crew moving into the area, told her single women living alone are targets. You know what she said?" Eleanor's eyebrows raised in question. "She said, 'I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I've been preparing for men like these my entire life.'" There was something in her eyes, Ellie, like she wasn't just talking about home security systems. The bell above the door jingled, and both turned to see Daniel Patterson, the town's doctor. "I treated her for a minor cut last month," he said, lowering his voice. "She has a Marine Corps Scout sniper tattoo. I looked her up. The name Catherine Reynolds appeared in redacted files from operations in the Middle East. My friend wouldn't say more, just told me, if that's who I think it is, she's not someone who needs protection. She's someone you pray is on your side." The first sign came 3 weeks later, a slaughtered calf left by her fence line. The second was a nighttime visit, 3 men in a pickup truck, firing shots over her roof before speeding away. Kate reported both incidents to Sheriff Whitaker, with the calm of someone discussing the weather. "Ms. Reynolds," Tom said, exasperation coloring his tone, "the Mendy's gang isn't playing games. They've been systematically taking over ranches across 3 counties. They either buy people out at pennies on the dollar or they escalate until—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Until what, Sheriff? Until the owners leave or die?" Tom nodded grimly. "These men target the vulnerable because the vulnerable are predictable," Kate said. "I am neither." As she walked him to his car, Tom noticed small changes around the property. Motion sensor lights, reinforced shutters, discreet cameras under the eaves. "You seem well prepared," he observed. Kate's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You have no idea." In the shimmering heat of a Tuesday afternoon, 3 black SUVs rolled up Kate's long driveway, dust billowing behind them like malevolent spirits. 5 men emerged. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, was Javier Mendes. Kate had memorized his face, tracking the Resurrection Riders' movements through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. They didn't bother knocking. Mendes stood on her porch, arms crossed, while his men spread out around the house, a show of force meant to intimidate. "Ms. Reynolds," he called out, "we should talk about business." Kate opened the door and stood in the frame, deliberately keeping her hands visible. They all carried themselves with the false confidence of men who had never faced real resistance. "I'm not interested in selling," she said simply. Mendes smiled, all charm and veneered civility. "I don't believe I mentioned buying." "You didn't have to. You've made offers to every property along the county line. When people refuse, accidents start happening." Something flickered in Mendes' expression, surprised that this isolated woman knew so much about his operations. "You're well informed," he conceded. "Then you know that I always get what I want, one way or another." "Not this time," Kate stepped aside. "But please come in, let's discuss why." Inside, the ranch house was spare but comfortable. The only notable feature was a framed photograph on the mantel, Kate in military uniform standing beside a smiling woman with bright eyes, and a teacher's gentle demeanor. "Your husband?" Mendes asked mockingly. "A friend," Kate replied. "Caroline Mitchell. She was a kindergarten teacher in El Paso. She died protecting her students during a cartel shootout. Santiago Reyes was aiming for a rival who'd taken shelter in the school. She used her body as a shield for 5 children." Mendes' expression changed, almost imperceptibly. Everyone in the Southwest underworld knew Santiago Reyes, the enforcer whose brutality had become legendary before his mysterious disappearance. "A sad story," he said dismissively, "but irrelevant to our business." Kate smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made Mendes suddenly uneasy. "It's entirely relevant. You see, before Reyes died, he made a point of telling everyone that no one, especially not a woman, could ever outshoot him." For the first time, Mendes looked at Kate, really looked at her, taking in the straight posture, the calloused hands, the eyes that assessed and calculated. "Who are you?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. "Just a rancher. But before that, I was the person who put a bullet through Santiago Reyes' skull from 1,800 meters away, after he killed Caroline." The room went silent. One of Mendes' men shifted nervously. "You're lying," Mendes said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The military record says it was a classified operation against an unspecified target. But you and I know different, don't we? Because Reyes worked for you before he went independent." Mendes' hand moved subtly toward his waistband. "I wouldn't," Kate said quietly. "Look at your chest." A small red dot hovered over Mendes' heart. He froze. "What you don't understand is that this ranch isn't just land to me. It's a fortress I've spent 7 years perfecting. There are 3 sniper nests with clear sight lines to this room. I chose this land specifically because I knew you'd come for it eventually." Mendes' face had gone pale beneath his tan. "You're outgunned," he said, struggling to regain control. "No," Kate replied simply, "I'm really not." As if on cue, the lights cut out. The house plunged into darkness before emergency lighting glowed from recessed fixtures. Outside, the engines of the SUVs suddenly died. "EMP device," Kate explained calmly. "Disabled your vehicles and electronic devices. Your men outside are currently being held at gunpoint by associates who, like me, believe that communities shouldn't live in fear of men like you." It was a bluff. There were no associates, but Kate had calculated that Mendes would believe her. Men like him always assumed that power operated through networks, through loyalty purchased or coerced. "You can't win this," Mendes snarled. "I already have," Kate replied. "Every criminal operation you've run for the past 5 years has been documented. Every bribe, every threat, every connection to corrupt officials. While you were expanding your territory, I was building a case." She glanced at the window, where headlights were now visible coming up the road. "That would be the authorities now." Mendes lunged then, drawing his weapon with practiced speed. But Kate was faster, had always been faster. Before his gun cleared the holster, she had disarmed him with a precise strike that left him gasping. The red targeting dot never wavered from his chest. "That's not a laser sight," Kate said softly. "It's a projection, a simple trick but effective." Understanding dawned in Mendes' eyes, humiliation followed by rage. "You're alone. You've been alone this whole time." Kate's expression softened slightly. "I was alone when I put a bullet in Santiago Reyes. I was alone when I chose this land as a trap, but I'm not alone in wanting to stop you." Outside, Sheriff Whitaker's voice called through a megaphone, ordering Mendes' men to drop their weapons. Backup had indeed arrived, not federal agents, but the townspeople of Copper Valley, led by their sheriff, armed and determined. "You inspired them," Kate explained. "Your threats, your violence. While you thought you were breaking their spirit, you were giving them something to stand against. That's Dr. Patterson out there with his hunting rifle. Eleanor Hudson from the diner has her late husband's shotgun. even Mr. Collins from the hardware store. Mendy stared at her with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," Kate said simply, "it is." The sun was setting when Sheriff Whitaker finally left, the Mendy's crew in custody. Kate sat alone on her porch, watching the golden light fade from the distant mountains. The photograph of Caroline sat beside her, propped against a mug of cooling tea. "It worked," she said softly to the image, "just like we planned." Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Federal agents arriving tomorrow. They want your statement." Kate smiled. The information she'd gathered on the Resurrection Riders had been her real weapon, more powerful than any rifle, more precise than any bullet. The first hints of dawn found Kate standing at her kitchen window, watching as the desert landscape transformed from indigo shadows to amber warmth. Sheriff Whitaker arrived early, exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "The feds are on their way," Tom said, accepting coffee with grateful hands. "They'll want everything you have." "Which is what exactly?" he continued, studying her. "You're not just ex-military. No regular Marine sets up an operation like this." Kate moved to a seemingly ordinary bookshelf and pressed against its edge. It swung outward silently, revealing a small room lined with monitors, file cabinets, and communication equipment. Tom's coffee sloshed dangerously as he straightened in surprise. "Jesus Christ." "After Caroline died, I couldn't just walk away," Kate explained. "Santiago Reyes worked for the Resurrection Riders. Taking him down wasn't enough, not when the organization that created him was still destroying communities." She pulled open a drawer filled with meticulously labeled files. 7 years of surveillance, bank records, phone logs, corrupt officials on payroll. Caroline was a planner too. She taught kindergarten, but she had systems for everything. She would have appreciated the thoroughness. "You loved her," Tom said simply. Kate's hand stilled on the files. "She was my heart. We met when I was stationed at Fort Bliss. She volunteered teaching English to military spouses. When I left the service, we had plans to build a life together." Her eyes drifted to a small photograph pinned to the wall, Caroline laughing, her head thrown back in abandoned joy. "The shooting happened 2 days before I was discharged." The sound of tires on gravel pulled them from the moment. Through the window, they could see Eleanor Hudson's old station wagon making its way up the drive, followed by several other vehicles. Outside, a small procession had formed. Eleanor carried a covered dish. Dr. Patterson stood beside his truck, medical bag in hand. Mr. Collins from the hardware store was unloading lumber from his pickup. Behind them, at least a dozen other townspeople emerged from their vehicles, each carrying tools, food, or supplies. "What's all this?" Kate asked, confused. "Well, we figured your fence took some damage yesterday," Eleanor explained. "Town meeting last night. We decided it wasn't right for you to handle repairs alone, not after what you did for us." "I didn't do it for," Kate began. "We know," Dr. Patterson interrupted gently. "That's why we're here." Something unfamiliar and warm unfurled in Kate's chest as she watched the townspeople already beginning repairs, setting up food, creating a small bustling community on her once isolated property. "Turns out you weren't as alone as you thought," Tom said softly. Special Agent Diana Chen arrived at noon, startled to find a community work party in progress. Kate showed her the hidden room, the extensive files, the evidence she'd collected over 7 years. "This is extraordinary," Chen murmured. "How did you manage this alone?" "I had military training, time, and motivation," Kate replied simply. "And I wasn't entirely alone. I had help from former colleagues, satellite imagery, access to certain databases. The rest was just patience." For hours, Kate walked Agent Chen through her findings. The financial network, the bribed officials, the shell companies laundering money from trafficking operations. "This is the missing piece," Chen said, examining a particularly damning set of records. You realize this will bring down more than just Mendes. There are people in positions of considerable power implicated here. That was always the goal, Kate replied. Taking down foot soldiers doesn't dismantle the system that creates them. Have you ever considered consulting work with the Bureau? Chen asked. We could use someone with your perspective. Before Kate could respond, Elinor's voice called from the kitchen, announcing lunch was ready for all those government folks too. A genuine smile transformed Kate's serious features. Maybe someday, but right now I have a community to get to know. Spring arrived in Copper Valley with wildflowers and news that federal indictments had been handed down against 27 individuals connected to the Resurrection Riders, including judges, a state senator, and a regional DEA director. Kate's testimony had been devastating in its precision. The media had attempted to turn her into a hero. She had declined all interviews, all accolades. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life in the community that had embraced her. On a warm May morning, she stood beside Sheriff Whitaker at the newly established Copper Valley Community Center, watching as Elinor Hudson cut the ceremonial ribbon. The building, once abandoned, had been transformed with funds seized from Mendes' operation. Caroline Mitchell Memorial Community Center, Tom read from the freshly painted sign. She would have been honored. She would have been first through the doors, organizing reading groups and craft circles, Kate replied, a bittersweet smile playing across her lips. Young Sarah Collins, Mr. Collins' granddaughter, approached shyly, clutching a book. Miss Kate, my grandpa says you know about protecting people. I want to learn too. Kate knelt to meet the child's eyes. There are many ways to protect people, Sarah. Some use strength, some use knowledge, some use kindness. Which is best? The girl asked earnestly. Kate thought of Caroline, who had used her body as a shield for children not her own. She thought of Elinor, whose casseroles and persistent friendship had breached walls Kate had spent years building. She thought of the townspeople who had stood against Mendes, armed with hunting rifles and generations of stubborn resolve. The best protection comes from the community, Kate said finally. People looking out for each other. That's something no weapon can match. As the meeting began, Kate took her place in the circle, no longer apart, no longer merely watching from a distance. Caroline's photograph had been given a place of honor near the entrance, her bright eyes seeming to approve of this new purpose, this transformation of vigilance into belonging. Outside, the desert stretched vast and unforgiving as it always had. But within these walls, something precious had taken root, something Kate had protected first with the skills of a warrior, but would now nurture with the care of a gardener. This, she realized, was Caroline's true legacy. Not vengeance executed with sniper precision, but community cultivated with patient hands. In the aftermath of violence, they had built something that violence could not destroy. And in that building, Kate Reynolds, once the ghost behind the scope, had finally found her way home.